Step 2, St. John Climacus, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Step 2, on Detachment. The man who really loves the Lord, who has made a real effort to find the coming kingdom, who has really begun to be troubled by his sins, who is really mindful of eternal torment and judgment, who really lives in fear of his own departure, will not love, care, or worry about money or possessions, or parents, or worldly glory, or friends, or brothers, or anything at all on earth. This is the perspective of eternity versus temporality. When we truly engage in finding eternity, everything else is secondary. Quote, after our call, which comes from God and not man, we have left all that is mentioned above, and it is a great disgrace for us to worry about anything that can not help us in the hour of our need, that is to say, the hour of our death. For as the Lord said, this means looking back, and not being fit for the kingdom of heaven. Knowing how fickle we novices are, and how easily we turn to the world through visiting or being with worldly people, when someone said to Christ, "Suffer me first to go and bury my father," our Lord replied, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead." It's important that our search for God consumes us wholly, elsewise we'll always rock between moving towards God and running back to the cares of this world, between following Christ and running back to bury the dead. Quote, it is worth investigating why those who live in the world and spend their life in vigils, fasts, labors, and hardships, when they withdraw from the world and begin the monastic life, as if at some trial or on the practicing ground, no longer continue the discipline of their former spurious and sham asceticism. I have seen how in the world they planted many different plants of the virtues, which were watered by vainglory as by an underground sewage pipe, and were hoed by ostination, and for manure were heaped with praise. But when transplanted to a desert soil, inaccessible to people of the world, and so not manured with the foul-smelling water of vanity, they withered at once. For water-loving plants are not such as to produce fruit in hard and arid training fields. St. John here notices that even seeming virtues can be not so virtuous because they're spurred on, they're invigorated by our vainglory, our seeking of praise, or by our pride simply to feel better than others. And so he notices that many people who seemed virtuous, when they were complimented or recognized, somehow gained a prestige because of what seemed to be their spiritual life. In fact, when all of the water of praise is taken away from them and they move to the desert, immediately they no longer had the appetite to serve God and to exercise themselves as they had before. And so this betrays that their true motivation was not God, was not love for God, but rather love for the praise of men. Quote, the man who has come to hate the world has escaped sorrow, but he who has an attachment to anything visible is not delivered from grief. The ascetic life is in fact a life of joy, and the reason we don't see that is because we're attached to things in this world. if we had the faith to leave them, we would see that what they offered to us was hollow and fleeting, and that the joy of following God is much deeper and more real, more life-giving, and more captivating, more exciting. Quote, let us pay close attention to ourselves, so that we are not deceived into thinking that we are following the straight and narrow way, when in actual fact we are keeping to the wide and broad way. The following will show you what the narrow way means. Mortification of the stomach, all night standing, water in moderation, short rations of bread, the purifying drought of dishonor, sneers, derision, insults, the cutting out of one's own will, patience in annoyances, unmurmuring endurance of scorn, disregard of insults, and the habit when wronged of bearing it sturdily, when slandered of not being indignant, when humiliated not to be angry, when condemned to be humble. Blessed are they who follow the way we have just described, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Quote, if anyone thinks he is without attachment to some object, but is grieved at its loss, then he is completely deceiving himself. It's easy for us to deceive ourselves into thinking we're farther along on the spiritual journey than we are. And yet, one safeguard against this pride is to carefully watch the movements of our heart, to take its temperature, and to see when we lose things that should not be important to us, do we despair, or do we remain focused on God? We may think we're not attached to something, but if we grieve its loss, then we are in fact, as St. John says, attached. Quote, and this following quote is helpful for those who may be considering the monastic call. Let's hear St. John. If young people who are prone to the desires of physical love and to luxurious ways wish to enter the monastic life, let them exercise themselves in all fasting and prayer, and persuade themselves to abstain from all luxury and vice, lest their last state be worse than the first. This harbor, and here he's referring to monasticism, provides safety, but also exposes one to danger. Those who sail the spiritual seas know this, but it is a pitiful sight to behold those who have survived perils at sea, that is, perils in the world, suffering shipwreck in harbor. And so St. John Climacus advises those in the world who are thinking to leave the world and become monastics, first to apply themselves to the spiritual life as if monastics while in the world, while out at sea, because they may find that if they enter the harbor of monasticism, not having the correct approach and the correct humility and sincere desire to find God, then they may be worse off shipwrecked, as he says, in harbor, though they were surviving at sea in the world. And St. John closes his chapter in this way, quote, this is the second step. Let those who run the race imitate not Lot's wife, but Lot himself, and flee.